Awesome. Thank you, Jasmine. And thank you everyone for joining us today and taking a Saturday afternoon to learn about data science and spotting fake news. So again, the name of our program is Fakebook, using data science to spot fake news. I do want to indicate before we get started that this is going to be a multi-part series. So we're going to talk more about the background and kind of criteria of identifying fake news. And then in our future sessions, we'll go more into like the programming aspect of it using specific languages. So I want to start off again, we'll quickly introduce ourselves. I'll pass it over to Teon.
So hello everyone again, my name is Dr. Teon Brooks. I received my PhD from NYU in experimental psychology, focused on psycholinguistics, so psychology of language, and neuroimaging work. And this is the basis of like how I really got interested in like understanding like computations in humans and computation in machines. My daytime job is as a product manager for Mozilla Firefox. I spent the past 3 years at Mozilla working as a data scientist. So I'm very familiar with like how data science is used in the technology space to better inform like how users like or use their products. And I wanted to figure out how can we best communicate what we do at a technology company and what researchers do and formulate it in a way that we can share it with the public. So Steve and I, and I'll pass it to Steve in a bit. Steve and I first met when we were working on a project at NYU, and it was an NSF-funded grant called Brainwaves. With Brainwaves, we were teaching high school students in New York City about cognitive neuroscience. So we were trying to say, hey, if you have an EEG, so if you have one of these, you can like put this on your scalp and measure like electrical activity. And it's pretty neat. We created an app that allows for you to stream the data, and you can see your brain data in real time for like the first time. And hopefully we may be able to do this in like future meetings in real life, that we can actually give you an EEG so you can see your own brain activity. So we had this, and we also walked students through how the brain activity can be used as a metric for understanding, say, some type of psychological process. So we showed them how to create their own experiments, and we showed them how their brain data correspond to like the different experimental manipulations, and gave them a framework for teaching them how to understand neuroscience in the brain. And we wanted to take this a step further, so we formed Computation and Education Labs. We expanded the scope of what we wanted to do beyond neuroscience, and we also wanted to include data science as one of the foundations of the types of things that we wanted to educate both the youth and the community at large. So we've been starting around, this is our first programming that we've done, and we've been getting the ball rolling over the past like year and a half. And we're geared up to be more involved in the community and doing more programming, and also figuring out ways of how can we take this knowledge that we know about cognitive science, data science, and figure out how can we apply it to the day-to-day questions and problems that we face. So I will pass it off to Steve now, and he can tell you a bit more about himself.
Hi, everyone. As I mentioned before, my background has been focused on education. Originally started off studying engineering, but realized that was not my path forward, that there was a lot of problematic parts within a lot of the companies. In any case, without going on a rant around that, found and loved teaching. I had the very distinct pleasure of teaching with Josh out in East Harlem for a couple of years. And then went on to do more professional development and research, currently getting my doctorate at Teachers College in educational technology. That's always been a theme throughout all of my experiences, was that I've always really focused on how we can bring computation into whatever it is we're doing, even art, right? That there's ways of being able to connect everything back to computation. And as I mentioned, as Teon mentioned, we were able to connect on the Brainwaves project from NYU and start our nonprofit, which you have before you, and proud to help lead on the curriculum and instruction side. And before I kick it off to Josh, I'm gonna do a little brag for him. He just got accepted into his doctoral program at Columbia for science education. So soon to be, I'll pass it to now, soon to be Dr. Modeste.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you, Tina. And I got some other congrats in the chat. Thank you. As Steve mentioned, I had the pleasure of working with Steve. I'm currently a high school science teacher in New York City. I teach high school biology, AP Bio. My background, I went to the State University of New York at Plattsburgh, got my combined bachelor's and master's in biology and adolescent education. And I've also had some research experiences in New York City at the New York Stem Cell Foundation, using stem cells to derive different treatments for Parkinson's disease. And I also had the opportunity to do some research in Townsville, Australia at James Cook University, doing some phylogenetic research on coral reefs. And so what brings me into this work, I'm currently the professional development coordinator for CiELabs. But as a high school teacher, I find this topic super interesting as I'm having students bringing sources to me from like Facebook or Instagram or TikTok even as a source. So I thought that this would be an important conversation for us to have as adults, and also carry on what we learned today to any children in your lives that you love. So I'm happy that Mars is here to get a head start on that. But thank you again, everyone, for joining us. So briefly, we're gonna get into the agenda. So we just went over our introductions. We're gonna start off with a little background on the history of science. We'll talk about some of the data that we could use to look at the reliability. We're gonna collaboratively come up with some criteria for what we could use to determine whether or not a source is reliable. Look at some of the currently used tools, and hopefully by the end of today's session, you will leave with your own rubric that you can use when looking at a source to determine whether or not it's something you should trust or not. So I do want to talk about some norms. So I know that we're all currently in different locations, different spaces, but what are some ways that we can create a space where all voices are heard today? And you can feel free to drop some suggestions in the chat or unmute yourself. But what are some things that we can do to make sure that everyone's voice is heard? Awesome, I see some stuff in the chat. Cool, so Steve just dropped a link to our note catcher in the chat. We're gonna periodically be jotting down some of the important points in that note taker as a summary of today's. So Tina mentions take turns. I agree, making sure that everyone gets a chance to hear. Another one that I'm pretty sure we're mostly familiar with for Zoom is unmute if you're not talking. I see Lackming mentions respect, definitely. So a lot of the stuff that comes up when we talk about fake news is typically political, and we may have differing political ideas, so just being mindful of that and making sure that we're bringing it back to the data science behind the facts. Give equal airtime as much as possible. I agree. So later on in the session, we will have some time for breakout rooms. So make sure you take an opportunity to engage in the breakout rooms, but also make sure everyone else has a chance to share in the breakout rooms as well. We don't want it to be a space for one person. I'll give another minute or so if anybody has any suggestions in the chat, or if they want to unmute about norms where we can make sure everybody's voice is heard. Awesome, thank you all for sharing. So we'll get started up with this post. So on March 11th, 2011, there was a large nuclear disaster at Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant in Japan. This image was posted on Imgur, a photo sharing website in 2015. And for those of us that cannot see it, it's a picture with some flowers that look kind of wonky. And there's a caption that says, "Not much more to say. This is what happens when flowers get nuclear birth defects." And the question that I want to pose right now is, does this post provide strong evidence about the conditions near Fukushima Daiichi power plant? Um, so what are your thoughts? Does this give us any indication of what it's like to live around that nuclear power plant? Feel free to unmute yourself or type it in the chat. Cool, I see some things in the chat. Matt says correlation is not causation.
I'm unmuting for a second.
It's
just a random image on the internet. And at this point in time, it's been quite a while since the internet's been floating around. You can assume that it's been photoshopped. Whether or not it's real or not, even if it's like a little bit of tweaking on the image, it might have been manipulated in some way.
Mm-hmm. Awesome, definitely. I saw someone else, Marta, mention Photoshop manipulation, which is a huge deal now, especially with like deep fakes, where they can make a video essentially of someone saying something, but it's all artificial intelligence and CGI. It could be from somewhere else. There's no information that tells us that this was taken in Japan, even. Right, there's probably some metadata behind this photo that could give us some information location. Yeah, Vanessa mentioned it doesn't show the actual location. Cool. So here's another question. Here's a quote, actually. "We're now living with the repercussions of our citizens having low media literacy. Everything is fake news. And not being able to solve problems that impact us all collectively, e.g. climate change, living wages, food scarcity, maybe political associations. But what are the potential causes? And what do you think are the impacts of fake news?" And again, feel free to type it in the chat or unmute. What do you think are some of the causes of fake news, and what might be some of the impacts of that? I got some stuff in the chat coming through. Awesome. Thank you guys for being so engaged right now. This makes it so much more fun. Lack mentions, what are the intentions or points for this article? So that's a great question to ask when assessing a source. Emotion, right? So emotion could be a potential cause for fake news. If I'm upset about something, I might say something I don't mean, and that could potentially be spread. Some sources of fake news just like getting attention for attention's sake, right? The louder they say it, the more attention they're gonna get, and some people may take that as truth. Distorted reality, some people may have, or anti-science if there's political association or political belief that may perpetuate some of these ideas. Marta mentioned some causes. It's easy to fabricate and manipulate people. Very, very true. A lot of this is about psychology and how we pull on the emotions of people that are reading, especially on things like Facebook or Instagram, social media. Some people just like to prank others, right? Maybe it's duping them for money, or duping them for a vote, or duping them for selfish reasons. Vanessa mentions misunderstanding or political agenda might cause fake news to be spread. And the impact is that we could make bad decisions because of that, potentially irresponsible decisions. Crocs mentions manipulating opinions. Matt, tribal thinking and reinforcement of prior held beliefs. That's a good one. Tribal thinking and reinforcement of prior held beliefs. Then Janice mentions one's conditioning during the years, right? So a lot of these beliefs may come from how we were raised, or the environment we were raised in, or the people that we were raised around, and all of those things can condition us mentally, kind of like Pavlovian conditioning in a way. Lack mentions an impact it can affect people's decision making. It can hide bad actions, right? If someone did something bad and they want to hide it, then they can put out some news that says contrary to that. Impacts destroying political systems, right? Also talking about power. There are certain power dynamics that might cause certain stories to be spread. Trust in science, communities, trying to look better than someone else. Definitely, like gassing yourself up, or saying, making claims that are not necessarily true, or making something look worse than reality. Absolutely. So I'll give about another minute if anyone wants to hop in. We have some really great ideas though. Awesome. So Steve is about to drop a link to a Padlet in the chat. And I'll show you quickly what a Padlet is. I don't know if many of you have interacted with Padlet before, but once you get the link, you'll be pulled up to this page. And you can add to the Padlet. So at the bottom right, there's a plus button. And you can click that plus button and add, what are some outrageous claims that you have heard that have been spread as truth? So again, let me just pull this up.
In terms of fake news, the concern about 5G
Mm-hmm.
and the health issues around it, I mean, like you're even seeing it here with the 5G icon right here. That's something I've heard, but I feel like there is intermingled with other information on how there's been concerns about people living by power stations and all, which I've heard way before 5G, and that seems a bit more probable, but I don't know. That's the real thing. I don't know.
Nah, I think that's a good point. I think sometimes some of these stories may originate from truthful ideas or truthful phenomena. And then over time, like as people play telephone and share that message, sometimes we might get misinterpretations of that message. Cool. So I see Alex has his hand up. Alex, feel free to unmute.
Yeah, one that's particularly interested in, which I think is really relevant to the GenSpace crowd, and which is, I think, also interesting for this because it sort of, like, politically, it runs the opposite direction of what most people are thinking about, is GMO fear-mongering, which is, like, huge on sort of the opposite spectrum that most people would associate fake news with. And I think for GenSpace, that's like a huge deal because it basically tries to vilify like everything that they stand for.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for sharing, Alex. And as Steve mentioned, this is our first GenSpace presentation. So if anyone is more familiar with the community and ideas that are especially relevant to GenSpace, definitely feel free to add those in. Cool. So I'll give us about, let's say, 5 more minutes to hop onto this Padlet. Again, the link is in the chat. Feel free to add images if you want, or GIFs, or if there are links to particular articles you want to, but I'll give us some time to populate this Padlet. Cool. So I see people are adding. So continue adding. You should be on the link, and if you have any other stories, feel free to share. But what we're going to do, continuing with this Padlet, is we're going to warm you up for our breakout sessions. So in a few minutes, Steve is going to open up a breakout room, and you'll be in a smaller group with some of the people in this session. What we'd like you to do is to take some time to introduce yourself in the small group if you can, and also share your story. If you have something that you added to this Padlet, or if you have another story that that you didn't get to add but you want to share. So we're going to take some time to do that in breakout rooms.
Opening up the break rooms now.
Awesome. So you should get a notification to hop into the breakout room. Hello, everyone that's just joining us. Welcome. All right, Steve, I'm gonna hop in some of the rooms to facilitate the convo. If you want to just make sure people can get into the rooms.
Sure. And let us know if you're having difficulty getting into the breakout rooms.
All right, well, whoever I just ghosted, sorry.
Awesome, we're coming back now. So thank you all for sharing out in the groups. I heard some really great things in there. I was in group 1. We talked a little bit about the anti-vax movement and kind of like also healthcare providers. Anybody want to share anything that came up in their group? About 1 more minute.
Yeah, so hey, I'm Nico again. I'm was part of group 9. I was with work group 9. That's his name, but I didn't catch his name. We were talking about 5G and the 5G towers, and he had mentioned that he actually saw a sign on the tower warning people that it can be damaging to health, which I think is interesting because I never even consider that, like that there would be signs and warnings as well.
Mm-hmm. Awesome, thanks for.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, if you actually see, I see your camera too. Work group 9.
Yeah, it says the sign is from I don't know whether you can see that.
Oh, I see it. Yeah.
Yeah,
That's actually quite a big sign.
General population health, or whoops, sorry about that. It said may exceed in all capital letters and bold the FCC general population exposure limit. So my house is my 2nd story house, and the antenna is not that far, and there's houses right next to it that are there. I don't know how far it would go. You know, I believe it decreases, the radiation decreases at the square root of the distance, you know, but so I'm not concerned about it, but it is interesting that they would put something there.
Mm-hmm. Very good point. Thanks for sharing that picture too. Do you know who posted the picture? We got a question if you know who posted the sign. Was it like the Department of like Service or something, maybe?
Or was it like Verizon directly?
Oh, it was. I believe it's Verizon. It doesn't say on the. Yeah, it does. It has Verizon on the bottom of it. And it says, do not work beyond this point.
Interesting. Awesome. Anybody else want to share out? I will share one thing that came up in our group. I was with Alex and Marta, and we were talking about the anti-vax movement, and kind of how, like, a couple years ago, before the pandemic, anti-vaxxers had like this stereotype of being suburban white women, like, that read an article from a long time ago, and were perpetrating this information. But as we got into the coronavirus pandemic and with the rollout of this current vaccine, a lot of socio-cultural ideas started to come up about people we wouldn't necessarily think of as anti-vaxxers. And we talked a little bit about like the Tuskegee syphilis trials, and how, like, vaccines or healthcare in general could cause certain feelings for people of color or underrepresented groups that may have a lack of trust in the healthcare system. So that kind of came up in our discussion. Awesome. So we'll have more opportunities to do breakout rooms and continue those conversations. And Steve, are we going to do a break, or are we going to pass it to Teon?
I think let's pass stuff to Teon.
Cool. So I'm going to just give us a brief overview of the life cycle of like the scientific research process. And it's more to give us an understanding of like, how does it go from like the idea that someone might have in the lab, what motivation people may have around that research project, and introduce some new concepts that have changed in the way that the scientific dissemination has changed over time. And that's primarily around preprints. And you may have heard more about preprints very recently, given the amount of research that's being done on COVID-19. Traditional publishing has not yet caught up to the urgency of the moment. So preprints have provided an opportunity for scientists to share their work a bit earlier. And we can go over some of the pluses and minuses of like where preprints fit into this ultimate life cycle of scientific research. So I'll just briefly say, we'll go through the research question, research plan, putting that plan into motion, some analysis and write-up, preprints, and how you socialize your work. And socializing work is different in every field. So I will highlight some of that as well as we go through this. Next slide, please. So for the research question, often it's like, how does a research lab come to do the research that they do? So there are more than these four, but these are just 4 examples of like what might lead to a research question being asked or to be researched on. So it could be the inherent research interest of the researcher. So a researcher may have like an inherent like interest in, like, say, a particular area of the brain or how language works. That's how it is for me. I've been very interested in like how language works. So that's why I like did my research to better understand like how does the brain read? Like when we see a word, how does that work? I think that's really neat. And that's kind of just driven like my research questions when I was a researcher. Some of the other things that may drive research questions is the funders. So there are different funding sources, and the funding directives change over time. So what we've noticed recently is that there's been a larger emphasis on COVID-19 research. So this is not just a shift in the biomedical space. You also see the shift in the psychological, sociological spaces as well, with trying to understand like what leads someone to, so like the research around like vaccine hesitancy, like is there a way that we can reduce the number of people who may be hesitant around taking the vaccine? We've actually seen a lot of reduction in vaccine hesitancy that the media had initially just said that it was a concern within, say, the population of people of color, but we actually see a 50% reduction from like 60 to 30% in terms of vaccine hesitancy. pretty stable if you look at, say, different political groups. We've seen it pretty stagnant among the Republican cohort. So it's just very interesting to just like understand in terms of the research, like what will lead someone to be more willing to take a vaccine. And we also, what we'll get to later is that sometimes, well, that just having the data points itself can sometimes backfire, and we can talk through that. And there's a lot of great research to show like what are good effective ways of communicating that. So funding can be a major driver of like what research questions you're asking in your lab, because that is what keeps the lights on in your research lab. Then you may have collaborators who have like interesting projects that they're working on and they want you to lend your expertise there. So that also facilitates like some of the research questions that you may ask. And if you're running a lab, you may have students, and within your lab, your students' interests could lead to the types of research questions that you're asking. So this is often the case. You may have a student that join your lab, they have an interest in your subspecialty, but maybe it's part of the subspecialty you don't know so much about. So take, for instance, in the language research, if you're running a language lab where you're trying to understand how language is processed in the brain, your student might be actually interested in like how is language processed in machines. So that may not be in your area of expertise, but then you can help support that inquiry of questions. So that's usually how like research labs like frame the way that they are looking at questions, and these are just some of the ways I highlighted. Next slide, please. So the next step is that you have this idea, what do you do about it? So one of the things that researchers often do is read a lot of the relevant literature in that field. So before we just go and like say, hey, I want to understand this thing and I want to just run an experiment, oftentimes you go through like extensive like literature reviews. So that means that you're reading like academic articles, you're reading like review papers, and you're reading books on a given topic. So it gives you a better understanding of like what is the current state of the question that you're interested in answering, and what was some of the prior work that led us to understand what we know at this point. So reading the relevant literature is super important. Here are some key ways that scientists often find like scientific articles nowadays on the internet. Google Scholar has become like a really great like centralizer of like all of the different research topics. You can go to Google Scholar and you can search for a topic of interest or a researcher, and it will show you in their ranking like a link to like the abstract and a link to the source material. So that's really key in like searching across the different journal articles and like journals that we have a huge collection of. And we often do still face a problem with the accessibility of those articles. So Google may surface where the articles live on the web, but there are other tools such as Unpaywall. So Unpaywall is a really cool extension. You can go to unpaywall.org. And what it does, it tries to find the free version of any of the articles that you may come across. So there's still this tension within academic publishing where the old publishers still want for research institutions to pay hefty fees to have access to materials. And that's very frustrating on many levels. And one reason it's most frustrating is that like in the US, the research that we do is funded by the citizens. We pay our taxes to have this research done. So it should be of interest to the public to know where their tax dollars are being spent. As a fundamental thing is that we are funding the research, we have a right to know what we are funding. And there's a lot of initiatives within the federal government. If you go to the NIH has PubMed. PubMed would be another one that I could put up here on the slide. I just didn't have a chance to. But PubMed has a way of indexing all of the research articles that have come out of the biomedical space that's been funded by them. And it's a way that you can sidestep dealing with the paywall of an academic journal. So unpaywall that you see here will link you to either a preprint, which is an early edition of that article, or sometimes the postprint, which is like the final version that hasn't been typeset in the way that the journal likes. And it's one of the legal options that you have to like surface information on the web. Zotero is a great way to organize the content that you come across. It's also free and open source. It's a really great product, and it's how a lot of academics just store their bibliographies and like all the content around topics that they're interested in. So I use it. You can integrate it with Google Docs. It integrates with Microsoft Word. You can create your citation just by a simple button and a click. And it's really neat, and it really like encouraged the ethos of open source, that the software is freely available. You can see how it's created, and it really helps with facilitating academic research to be well organized and well distributed. Another product to mention would be Meta, and Meta is a new product that comes out of the Chan Zuckerberg initiative. And the idea behind Meta is that it sees that there's been such a large growth in the amount of research that has been produced, especially in like the biomedical sciences over the past decades. So what it's trying to do is take some of the powers of machine learning to try to surface some relevant articles that may be useful with the research project. So you can go there, and it's similar to like Spotify, where you can choose like what types of things you're interested in, and you can say, I want some of this and I want more of this. And it will try to curate a list of articles that you may want to read that you may have not been able to come across yourself. So there's tens of thousands, if not millions of articles that are just being produced at such a rapid pace, like monthly. This is trying to find that signal within all of the scientific publishing noise where it may be very relevant for the projects of interest. And then lastly, I would just like to shout out like Sci-Hub. Sci-Hub has done a remarkable thing, and it provides access to articles that may be behind paywalls. And so this is not a matter of legality of why I'm like suggesting it, but it's something to keep in mind that it will allow for you to research, and it's of the belief that knowledge should be free. Like knowledge, like having open knowledge is like a core fundamental pillar of a society to stay informed and knowledgeable, and what could prevent people from being able to discern truth from fiction is lack of access to knowledge. So Sci-Hub. And then I would just highlight two things here. We have like review articles that you might typically come across that a journal would, like that will be published in a journal. It's typically focused on a topic, and it's a synthesis of like a lot of contemporary work. And these are very useful when you're trying to get background knowledge on a given topic. And then books on these topics are also great overviews of the topic in general. But it usually is like a synthesis of like work that has got into general consensus in the field. So it may not be as current, so not published in the last 5 or 10 years, but it's still a great source to say, what was all of the research that was done in the 70s and 80s on this topic? And there's a lot of just like in terms of psychology, like a lot of great research has been done from like the 40s to the 70s, probably just like the early 20th century, that is really what informs us to this day on research that we're pursuing. Next slide, please. Yes, and Alex, you have a question.
Hey, yeah, didn't mean to barge in, but I just, when talking about like open sourcing or making scientific journal articles accessible, I think it's really important to remember Aaron Schwartz, because people might think that this is like, oh, it's not that big of a deal. You just go find the free version. But he killed himself about 10 years ago because he was facing jail time for trying to make JSTOR public. JSTOR is one of the biggest journal repositories, and he was founder of Reddit, so he wasn't just some random person. Like, he was like a millionaire, and still he couldn't get out. Like, he was trying to open source JSTOR, and he got some ridiculous jail sentence for trying to do that, and he killed himself. So
yeah,
yeah,
that's a great point. I'm really glad you brought that up. Yeah, I mean, just a brief aside, I received a fellowship through the Mozilla Foundation, and it was to work on open science. And one of the core things that I focused on there was the promotion of open science, both open access, open data, and open source, so that the scientific ecosystem can be equitable for everyone, so that there isn't this ability for, like, say, the rich universities and institutions to have access to things that other universities that have less resources can't have access to. And one of the biggest focus of that that fellowship was around open access and getting institutions to really change their practices. We see that, like, in the University of California, they have put forth like a mandate that all of the research that's coming out of the UC system be published in open access, because it's I think the morally right thing to do. And there shouldn't be a case where Aaron Swartz had to kill himself because the federal government and the US federal government was sentencing him to life just by trying to free knowledge. Like, I think like that is like that was fundamentally not okay. And I'm really passionate about like making sure, like, how can we have systems in place, because we have to change the way that the scientific process is currently being done. There's a Plan S, which is in the European Union. The European Commission is supposed to have enacted, I think either this year, next year. COVID has really like changed a lot of timelines, but all of the European institutions will have to publish open access, and either already now and in the future. And it's from these stories like of Aaron Swartz that really have pushed the legislation to try to change these paths. So, great point. I'll briefly just talk about getting the research plan into motion. So often what we do, we come up with a study design, and not every study that we're interested in requires an experiment. So there are great, rich methods beyond just experimentation that you can use to get to understand the question that you have in mind. Experiments are one way, observational studies are another, surveys are a great way. And this is these are different instruments and tools that we use as researchers to have a better understanding of the questions that we're trying to answer. So then you run your study, and then you collect these data points. And this is just like a screenshot of me in grad school, which is like forever ago now. Me putting my plan into motion for like my dissertation research. And next slide, please.
Real quick, Teon, Jane posed a question in the chat that maybe we can
bring
up.
Let's see.
She says, how do we make science profitable for scientists while maintaining and encouraging open access? It's such a hard trade-off.
Yeah, that's a very great question. The one thing I would say about like how the academic publishing works is that scientists don't make money off of it. So for every article that's hidden behind a paywall, that money goes directly to the publishers. They make around 30%. They have a 30% margin on the content that they produce. And if you look at anywhere on the stock market or like S&P 500, like that type of return on the product that they're not even generating, that it's being generated by the scientists, funded by the federal government, funded by the people, I just find that to be just like absolutely like unconscionable. So yes, so the profit is actually being shared by the publishers, not by the scientists. So in either system, that won't change. So that is great. The great point. And it's an unknown one for a lot of people, because you go to see, say, there's an article, it says it's going to cost $40 for me to access it. And then you're just like, okay, well, this is the money that's going to the researchers listed. They get no money. So how, I have a lot of problems with some of the academic system. One of the things that also that happens within this whole publishing program is that the reviewers are not paid to do the review work for these articles. So it's just seen as part of your job. That's how it's now been incorporated as part of your scholarly work to review articles of your peers, and it really helps make science better. Like, I think the review process is actually a very useful tool, but it has not been done in a reasonable or appropriate way to pay people what they're worth, because they're essentially volunteering to turn a profit for a predatory publishing system. So let's see, yeah. So a lot of the scientists just like do a lot of work, and they aren't it's not profitable. They're doing it for seeking knowledge, and I feel that all of the institutions surrounding it and that's involved with it should also not be making this ridiculous profit. So with this is just a brief overview of what happens next. There's this analysis phase. So you take the data that you may have collected in your study, you try to interpret it, and we'll talk about like some of the statistical tools that we use to try to determine if we do actually see a change in our data. Steve will talk about this after a break. And then you write this up. And there's just like some collaborative software that's used on the web. This one is Overleaf, which allows for you to collaborate, and LaTeX, which is like this markup language that allows for you to typeset your paper however you want to, used by some scientists. Also, you could just use Google Docs or Word. That's often what happens, and like is super useful to like get your thoughts together and collaborate with others. Next slide, please. Now, so I would like to highlight preprints. So preprints have been introduced relatively recently in terms of the biomedical sciences. They've been around longer so bioRxiv is a preprint server that hosts a lot of research related to biomedicine. And prior to bioRxiv, it inherits its name similarity to arXiv, which has been this preprint server used in the mathematics, computer science, and data science fields for the past, say 30, 40 years. So the nice thing about arXiv is that when everyone was coming online to the internet, scientists realized that they have a new opportunity to not have to interface with the old traditional publishing models as they used to. So what they decided to do was that they had a server on the web, which basically meant that they had a place to deposit their new findings, and they could get comments from their colleagues around the world. And this was like groundbreaking in terms of like the speed at which information could be disseminated and the type of commentary you can get from anyone in your field, and where they could leave the comments there and just like have a forum on a given topic. So arXiv have provided a great groundwork for the growth of preprint servers across other disciplines. So we have bioRxiv, and then we also have HAL, which is the preprint server based in France. And preprints have now come to a point where, say, I've just done my write-up, and I would like to first post it for comments to a broader audience, and also have a way to like share my work early and often. So with the preprint server, you can actually have multiple versions that say you've updated your writing over time. You can show like the different versions of that and how the evolution of your research paper has gone. And it allows for there to be comments from your peers and early feedback that can be incorporated, and it allows for the research to be enriched by the comments of our peers. And that's a very great thing about science, is that we make science better by working more collaboratively. And we see this as a tool that has helped make a lot of science available faster, open and freer, and greatly improved. One thing to highlight about preprints is that it fits in at a different place for disciplines. So as I mentioned, for computer science and mathematics, usually when, say, you've written your proof or you've written your new algorithm or the thing that you want to share, you would post it on archive, and that is usually the end state for that, that given topic. Or it could also be lived on in a conference where you want to share it with a broader audience. How it works for, like, say, biomedical research is that oftentimes preprints are the first along the path to have it published within, say, an academic journal or at a conference in its proceedings. So different disciplines take approaches to how preprints are treated as academic artifacts. That is just to say, if you were in the math department, they would have expectations that you have like your work on archive. Whereas if you were in the psychology department, they currently, and this is evolving in a different department, kind of expect that your work be shown in an academic journal where you can also have the preprint to point as like the initial starting ground for that research. So they're leaked, but preprints are typically not seen as final state within the, say, biomedical research field. But they've been very essential recently with the COVID-19 research, as we've had to respond very quickly and rapidly to the changing landscape of how this virus has persisted over this pandemic. So initially, there's been a huge growth in the amount of research done on COVID-19. That's the preprint server. Usually there's a 6 to 12 month time delay in where an academic article has been submitted and is now recommended for print in a journal. So that lead time is too long to try to share your work that may impact thousands, millions of people around the world. So we have to also use that as a gating technique so that we know that this is work that is very early. It has not gone through the peer review process, and I'll talk about what that is next in this last slide. So ways that we usually socialize our work are through, these are just 3 of those examples. I would just start with the academic journal first. So with, say, research on COVID-19, yes, we would have started with preprints that we would have submitted to, say, a journal. And now a lot of journals have come online to the idea that you first share your work as a preprint before it gets sent to them. That has changed. Like 5-10 years ago, that was not the case. They would not allow, a lot of journals did not allow for the research to be shared as a preprint first because they wanted the exclusive first print of it. But there's been a lot of change and momentum to really accept preprint as an artificial artifact that is worthy to be shared, and also prior to any further publications. So usually with peer review, you have, say, around 3 reviewers who would review your research. and they give feedback and recommendations to whether it should be accepted in a given journal for publication. So that's usually how the academic journal process works. You would then submit this manuscript to that journal, and then they would either approve or deny it. You may also socialize your work at, let's say, a conference. And at a conference, you have usually all of your peers in a given subfield. So this is a screenshot from Society for Neuroscience. This is actually one of the largest conferences there is. Around 30 to 40,000 neuroscientists would descend pre-COVID on the town and basically have a week-long conference dedicated to brain and cognitive science. So it's like a fascinating conference. And what you do there, you would submit your research for either a poster, which is usually the early stage of your analysis and write-up process where you want to share it with the world. People can come by, you have a nice poster there where you just show some of your analysis graphs, and you tell them the results at this early stage, and you can get in a conversation with them. A lot of great and further development of your work can be done at these poster sessions because you have researchers who are very interested, who are asking very interesting, sometimes challenging questions that is to be constructive for the work. That's the intent. So conferences can be really great, and also just the evolution of your research paper itself. And then there's also the promotion of your work on social media. So this can be either the journal or your preprint. And there's actually a lot of great research to show that using social media helps promote academic research. There's a lot of benefits to sharing your research on Twitter. It also gives it access to both your peers and this scientific community. Also, your the general population will have access and be looped in on the latest research that's coming out as well. So that's usually the arc behind the scientific research process. And I'll pause there and see if there are any questions we have.
So one question, which I attempted to answer, but Matt asked, is there any legitimate reasons for-profit driven publishers these days beyond the notoriety of being published in long established journals?
That's a great question. There are a lot of great open access journals that have really grown over the past say a few decades. The ones that come to mind that are really innovating in this space are eLife. eLife is for the life sciences, and they have been they actually are doing real-time experimentation on what would be the best way to share and communicate scientific research. One thing that they're doing now is that they're now taking a preprints first approach to how research is now being disseminated. So one of the experiments they're trying now is that they have accepted that preprints as a legitimate form of research artifacts. And what they will do is curate a list from those preprints and ask the author if they would like to submit this for further review, so that the preprint is just there, but they can have comments from reviewers as part of that full artifact. So these are different ways that they're looking to innovate in the space, because we know that the traditional publishing model hasn't really updated to say how computational notebooks work. And we'll get more into that in the next session that we have, next day session that we have planned, of how you can use your scripting and programming skills to detect fake news. And this, so eLife is one that comes to mind, Plus and Plus One. So Plus is the Public Library of Science. They are another publisher that has worked on giving the same rigor of scientific publishing, but in an open access way. there was such a great proliferation of just like open access that also had like these insidious profit goals similar to the closed for-profit journals. But what we've seen that's emerged over, say, this past like 10, 20 years is that there are like the real strong community-oriented, grounded nonprofit spaces that are pushing forth their publications for like the betterment of science.
Thank you. So let's take a 10-minute break. You know, we had a lot of good conversations earlier in the morning. Great to be able to meet everyone and be able to get your insights into the issues that you guys have been seeing. And then, you know, Teon, thank you for being able to go through kind of what does this actual science look like? When we're talking about journals, these sort of high quality or potentially low ones in other circumstances, you know, what does this actually look like? What is the process that they go through? So let's take a 10-minute break. And just to get you guys ready, feel free, if you want to, you can grab a beer. It'll have something to do with what we're going to be talking about next. As you see here, we're going to be talking a little bit about data, how it relates to beer, specifically Guinness, and, you know, getting everyone psyched and pumped and ready for it. We'll come back at, let's make it 4:33. It's no secret, but you know, now that I'm on the funding side of things, with funding research and then being able to see the structure of grants, like now I know exactly how much is going to get these publications out. Like I can figure out like it's about $50,000, anywhere from $50,000 to about $100,000 per special issue for some of these major publications for like ACM. And it's surprising, like the majority of it goes towards the editors. Like they get paid, I think for one of the special issues I supported, it was like $20,000 for about maybe a couple of months work, and that's part-time. And of course, almost like none of that goes to any of the researchers, right? And then the other like 10,000 or so ends up going towards like dissemination or the materials. It's crazy. It's like they're making so much money off of this.
That can like completely take us away from this model, but it's so entrenched. That's the most frustrating part, is that like we have a solution to this, but we have intransigence.
I kind of wonder, do you think there's like a way of like a GoFundMe sort of like model of, so like let's say instead of like basically philanthropy, Bill and Melinda Gates, right? Basically what they do is they go and they say, here's my perspective. I want these results, right? Out from the get-go. So then they select researchers that will help get them those findings, essentially, right? They're not going to choose people that will radically challenge any of their existing conceptions. So if we're doing that anyways, like why not just have like a public domain where it's just like, fund my research, Teon Brooks, you know, Steven Azeka, Josh Modeste, fund our research, and then we'll go do it.
I think there is a website. I have to just go find it. I remember this. It's like you basically, yeah, it's like the GoFundMe or the OnlyFans for research. Where it's like, yeah, that's essentially what it is. Let me see if I can find a link.
Yeah.
But we also know like the scale of what it costs to like run a research lab at a university, and like where most of that money goes to.
Oh my God. Like as much as I thought NYU was bad, right? It was like what, 60% overhead?
Yeah.
I think like Columbia takes, God, what was it? Was it like 80% or something like that? It's really bad. It's like you're already at a deficit before you get that grant. Like, yay, we got a $1 million, $2 million grant. So that means we can, I don't know what, pay for what we'll get 200,000 out of that for 5 years. So I can maybe pay one postdoc for like a fraction of a salary. that amount of time. It's crazy. Yeah, it's okay. Yeah, I agree, Jasmine. These are things that I've told NYU and Columbia anyway, so they can have that. They know they're taking too much of our money. Question being what we should have recorded. Yeah, that's funding, Nico, to your comment. It's money is always an issue in higher ed, and who funds and how they get funded is always a challenge. And there's a reason why larger institutions like NYU and Columbia are able to continue getting money, and where that money goes and why they're able to afford these new buildings through the endowments and everything. That's a business in the end of the day for them. Yeah. Good comment, Nico. Yeah, it's a good comment, Jasmine. As far as Josh, you're going to get to have that privilege soon, right? To get underpaid for grad student.
Yay!
So it's a rite of passage to have human rights labor abuses for your work, right?
Academic hazing.
Academic hazing.
Congrats, Josh. That's awesome to hear, though.
Thank you.
Maybe I should be talking less, Jasmine. To your point, it's okay as long as I get this out before this gets published. I think it's fine. Oh, you got a shout out, Josh.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting convo.
Oh, it's a good question. I'll kick that one to Teon. Matt had a good question.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that there are emerging groups. So the one that came to mind for me was the UC system. And it's also been pushed by a lot of librarians. So a lot of librarians are like really adamant, like on like and pretty radical in like their view as well that research and knowledge should be open. And that's like the whole like basis of like a library system, like be able to have like access to knowledge. And they're pushing a lot of the changes that they're seeing at the institutional level. We also see this happening at, I went to UNC Chapel Hill for undergrad, and I just saw that they're, the UNC librarian, like the chief librarian, has announced that like this is a model that they're pushing toward as well, having more open access systems. And also you're starting to see the fracturing of, say, the entrenched nature of, say, Elsevier as one of the publishers at a lot of institutions. Over the past, like, I say 5 years, and I think accelerated right now through COVID-19 with budgetary concerns, that universities are no longer renewing their contracts with Elsevier because they have felt that they have not been like a fair partner in this space, both with their closed model and also their willingness to change to a more open access model that would be reasonable in cost structure. So I think that there are definitely systems in place that are trying to address this. it's just that it's been a very slow process, but there have been some gains.
Okay, so I'll wait another minute for people to get back, but I just wanted to give everyone a heads up that we'll get started in a little bit. Okay, so as I mentioned before break, well, first off, welcome back, everyone. Hope you had a chance to grab whatever it is that you need for drinking or for a nice little break. You know, it gives us a nice friendly time to chat. And, you know, I'm probably I'm gonna lose my job after that conversation, but that's fine. It's worth it. So now we get to talk about the data portion. So we learned about as I mentioned before, Teon gave us a good overview of like, what does quality research look like? And, you know, what are some of the challenges, as we've actually had a lot of great conversation about open source nature of that. But now we have to get to some of the stats and some of the data behind all of this and why this matters. And to be able to do this, what I did was I want to make a sort of fun anecdote, and not even that, it's a historical stats trip that we're going to be able to take. So in this first slide, and this is specific to Guinness, so I have my little Guinness bottle. I'll be opening this up as soon as the session's over, but one of the first questions is from, well, to give you some background, Guinness from the time of 1887 to 1914, they grew all over the world, internationally. They're one of the largest producers of beers. They went from that, during that period of time, to producing over 84 billion pints a year. So that's a lot of pints, you know, going from a small batch to now internationally. So in the chat, what do you think is some of the challenges when you scale up from maybe producing a couple of million pints a year to now 84 billion pints internationally? Type in the chat, what do you think are some of the challenges that Guinness faced in being able to do that? You can also, feel free to unmute yourself if you want to. Yep, so I see a lot of stuff with distribution, logistics, supply chain. Oh, I like that, Phil. Consistency of product, space and people. I like the space in people's bellies. There's a finite amount of, I like quality, pricing, distribution. These are all great ones. So one of them, Phil hit up. All of these were very real problems. But one of the interesting one that we're going to attach onto for stats purposes is the quality. So easy if you're able to make a small batch of quality, right? That we can do this. We see this for wineries. We see this for distilleries. You know, it's one thing about making it for a small group of people. It's a whole nother thing. If you want to have the Guinness taste, have this quality of beer at scale, that how do we do this, right? And go ahead and go to the next slide. One way they started doing this was they knew that the flavor had something to do with the hops. So what they actually started doing is they looked at the fragrance of this, and then they tried to figure out maybe there's something about the size of these hops that make it consistent. So what they started doing was they produced about 5 million pounds of this at the time a year, so a lot of hops. They had to sort through, and surprise, fragrance is not a consistent measure from who's measuring it. That became not a good measure. Looks of it too, they weren't using precise measure. They weren't looking at particular hues. So this failed pretty miserably. So what they ended up starting to do was they started looking at the resin, and more specific of it, when they ground it up, they were looking to see whether the hops were either soft or hard, and which percentage of that batch is considered soft or hard. And go ahead and go to the next slide. So what they ended up doing And this is a real sort of the number of samples that they started off with. So some background knowledge, the Guinness, they were initially sourced in Kent, England. So that's where it's highlighted in red. And what they tried to do was they tried sampling different batches. So one of the questions that they had was, can't we just sample everything? Like, why don't we just sample every single batch that comes out of Guinness for all 84 billion of these? Why do you think that may or may not be a good idea? Go ahead and put it in the chat. Why can't you sample every single barrel that comes out of it? Like, Nico, it's a lot of work. I agree. Cost and time intensive. It's a lot of energy. I agree. Like, Tinas, that is entirely true. That the samplers could get drunk after a while. Great, yeah. So those are both, I like the sampler one. That is a very concern. We want our samplers to be, be able to survive their work and their day job. It also cuts into the actual product itself. That if you sample every single barrel, or if you sample even a subset of that, that's that much fewer that you can actually sell, right? So that's some of the reasons why they needed larger samples. And in this case, what they did, as you see here on the left side, from one farm or one production site with the hops, they took samples from 14 different barrels. And then from a different site, they took it from 11 different barrels. And they found that in this one site, the site to the left, that they, on average, as far as the hops had the appropriate number of hops, that about 8 of the barrels, there's about 8.4% on average of the adequate hops. Whereas on the right side, it's about 8.1% that was adequate hops. So to me, these are just numbers. Are they comparable? Is the 4.1 good enough? I don't know. Is it similar enough to 8.1? I'm not really sure, right? And that's the sort of problem that broke Guinness into, we need to hire some statisticians to be able to figure this problem out, because we get lots of numbers, but they're kind of meaningless numbers. So we have these two averages, 8.4 on one side and 8.1 on the other. And we need to figure out if this is good enough quality hops for all our beers. Go ahead and go to the next slide. Yes, exactly. So Tina's already jumping ahead of us as far as considering the margin of error and thinking about acceptable ranges. So I put a graph in front of you. Now, there's three different lines here, three different things to look at. There's one with medium variability. Don't worry about any of the labels here. Now, just take a look at these three different graphs and tell me in the chat, what do you see is similar between these three graphs? And what are some things that you see that are different between these three graphs? And go ahead and type it in the chat, or feel free to unmute yourself and share out. What are some similarities and what are some differences between these three graphs? Phase shifts, I like that. All three overlap. Oh, I like that. For Marta, she indicated distribution of results. Some are wide versus some that are narrow. Some have smaller ranges on low variability, some have large. Peak distance versus distribution. These are all good. Like, you guys are already ahead of the curve of using the language that we're going to be heading into. Some have, I like that for Tina, some have a larger overlap versus some that have maybe smaller overlaps. Okay, give it another second. Yeah. So these are all, and same colors. I like that. There we go. So these are all super insightful observations. And some of the things that I want to highlight here is on this graph, you'll see the dotted line that these all have the same averages. So if we go back to the previous slide, Josh. There you go. So once again, we had the 8.4%, 8.1%. And if you go to the next slide, these dotted lines, the left one, the dotted line on the left could be the 8.1, and the dotted line on the right could be 8.4. So they all have the same averages, but as we've seen and seen in the chat, these all look very different, that none of these graphs are exactly the same. And you guys have described some of the differences. So let's dive into this a little bit more. So let's look at the first example. So what does this first graph mean? Now, I already said and mentioned that all the averages in all three of these examples are going to be 8.4 and 8.1. So that's going to be the same throughout. Now, for this first one, what I've noticed is I'm now a Guinness taster, hopefully not getting drunk, but I tasted these 16 different batches on the top left here. And I found that one of the batches had about 8%. Okay, that's pretty close to the average. Another had 7.8. That's not too bad. There's another that has 8.6. Okay, and they all kind of average around to 8.4. And similarly for the 8.1 batch, okay, there's some that are 7.8, 8.1. So they're all somewhat close to the averages that we got. So it gives us kind of a medium, in this case, variability. Now go ahead and go to the next slide. Okay, now that's one scenario that we could have had. There's another scenario for the high variability one where, let's say I have these huge batches now, and now I have a little bit more of this variability. So if you take a look at the top left, that there's, when I sampled it, there's one that was 5.4 versus the other that's maybe another one that's 15.5. Now that's quite a bit different than the 8.4 one that we initially had. That this is pretty wide range. And similarly for the other 8.1 average one, that we had one that was 1.1%. That's probably not a great batch there. That's probably a pretty terrible sample, but it's offset by the one that's 10.1. So these are probably not the most consistent batches that we've ever come up across. If I'm Guinness and I'm having these different numbers coming out, it's like, oh, maybe we have a problem here. This is probably, maybe we need to figure out something to do with how we farm differently. Go ahead and go to the next slide. Okay. Or if I'm Guinness and I'm just about to jump off my seat and I'm about to make millions and billions of dollars more, there's this third scenario where it could be the scenario where, in this case, if assuming that 8.4 and 8.1 is good enough, that 8.5 is pretty close. And there's a lot of 8.4s that are really close to this. So there's low variability within this. Now, there's a lot of situations that could play out, whether or not this is meaningful or not. A lot of situations that could be figured out. And I like the one of Tina's comment, like we can manipulate some of these things. Like we could use this to find out which ones are the worst performing ones and just throw it out, right? But that's remembering that these are just a sample of a much larger population of hops that we're looking at. So if I'm sampling this particular batch, that, okay, we're getting pretty consistent numbers across the board for both of these batches. They're pretty good. Okay, now comes a set of next step. And go ahead and go to the next slide. Now we've thought of things of variability, okay? So now I like things, if I'm Guinness, I like things to be consistent. You know, I don't want all of my samples to be all over the place, so I want low variability. The other thing I want is I want all of my overall averages that we saw, the 8.4 and 8.1, to be close to each other. That if I have two averages that are way across, if I had an average that was like 59% and I had another average that's 1%, that's a pretty, those are meaningless to me then. That's like, oh, we have garbage batches. We're gonna have maybe something like Bud Light or now Quality. You know, we have these wider ranges of beer. So we want those to be as close to each other as possible. So the ideal maybe would be if I had another batch that I was sampling, that would be 8.3 or maybe 8.4. That'd be another average batch. So we use this equation here to sort of measure the two things. How much variability is there? And then how much is the difference between the means? So, and this is what we call the t-test. And for historical references, this was developed and found. You guys went through the history, and this was the reason why t-tests exist now is because of Guinness, and was because they want to maintain the quality. And something that I don't want to dive too much into, and Teon touched a little bit on, but there's something called a p-value, or 5%. So how many of these instances are coming out of randomness versus sort of a control? And basically, we want to be able to have as little random cases that are coming up that are just like, if I have something that all of the things I'm coming up with is randomly numbers that are created, numbers that are up there, that's not very helpful. That I want to have as much control within this as possible. Won't dive too much into that. But let's go ahead and go to the next slide. How can we use this? So I've been talking too much about Guinness. You know, I should get some money from them. They should hire me for some reason. And how does this now relate to fake news? So we can take these t-tests. So we can measure not only just variability, but the difference between means, right? And what we can do now is we can measure the means, in this case, of popularity of fake news websites versus popularity of just general websites as a whole. So you don't have to worry too much about the numbers here. But basically, if I'm a really popular website, does that match up with really popular fake news websites? And basically what they found using statistical analyses is that no, they don't. That surprise, fake news websites are typically not the most popular websites. That the ones that are producing the most fake news are typically the ones that in all honesty, I'm probably not even as familiar with. They're not going to be the as often as the New York Times, CNN, or even Fox News, that these are not the ones that are producing the most amount of fake news. Some are producing more so than others, but by far and away, there are these websites that are for these niche communities that are spreading it. So now we're able to do these sort of analyses, use these statistics to be able to give us some insights into what fake news looks like and how we can actually measure and sort of suss it out. In this case for popularity, but we could have easily done this for a number of other things. We could have looked at grade levels of writing styles. Like, is there and this is something that you can, a preview for our next session is, if I have an article that's written at a third grade level, there's ways of measuring that. Is that more or less similar to the popularity of the website, or to the number of the ranking of the fake news, to the popularity of fake news? We can measure these things and do some comparison amongst averages now. So a lot of interesting things that we could do with it that we'll dive a lot more into in our next session. So that's enough of me talking. And what we're going to do now is I'm going to shift it over to Josh. And he's going to lead us through. Let's do some hands-on. Let's explore some of these concepts a little bit more. So I'll pass it off to you, Josh.
Thank you, Steve. I have my Guinness in the fridge too, waiting for after this. All right, so we're going to get into kind of assessing the criteria that we're looking for. So kind of like Steve mentioned, there were certain criteria that Guinness was looking at initially that they realized was not what was going to determine the quality of their product. Similarly, there are characteristics of news sources and articles that we can use to help us determine and make the decision if we are going to trust a specific source or not. So here's a quick political cartoon from the New York Times. But as we start to think about how we can address fake news, what are some of the possible solutions to stop the spread of fake news? And what are some questions that we can ask ourselves when we're looking at a source? And you can answer these in the chat or feel free to unmute yourself. And I'll read the questions one more time. What are some possible solutions to stop the spread of fake news? And what questions can we ask ourselves when looking at a source?
I kind of feel like popularizing science media outlets and kind of like more direct examples of true news and kind of what we were talking about with like if a publication has been reviewed by 30 other scientists and has that peer review behind it and institutional backing, like that's already so much more successful than something we just see online. So more outlets like that.
Awesome. I really like that, going directly to the source. I read an article where basically like there's a technique that if you find a post on Facebook, you can click through the references and eventually get to like the original source, and that will usually give you the most information. Yeah, so someone says not the Onion, Jasmine. Yeah, the Onion is also a funny source that portrays news as real, but has usually funny stories. Think twice before you share, reshare, right? If you see a post on Facebook, be critical of it. Always giving direct source to the information, absolutely. Phil says propose a reliability score, which I think Teon and Steve started to mention earlier, where like there are certain journals that based on the number of times that they're referenced, they get this score. And the more times your journal is referenced, the more reliable it's considered to be. Yeah, Jasmine says, maybe it's not necessarily fake news, but thinking about biases. That's a really good one that we're gonna get into, and how news or data is presented. Check the credibility of the author and of the publisher, right? And there's an important distinction there too. Like, as we mentioned, there's a disconnect between the original author and the publishers, and there might be some biases hidden in there. Awesome. So what are some potential tools that are available? We talked about Sci-Hub earlier, which is an open source area where you can get scientific research articles. Problem with that is sometimes they're preprint still, so they may not have gone through the review process yet, or they might have been reviewed, but you only have access to the preprint. Washington Post has this great fact checker where they post articles and they use Pinocchio to rate the level of reliability. I saw Matt mention Snopes.com. Definitely, Snopes is one. Like if there's a myth or a rumor that you've heard of, you can type it in Snopes and they'll usually give you an idea of that. Any other tools or maybe websites or programs that people are familiar with? Jasmine says there's a list of predatory journals somewhere. Yeah, so she's gonna find that link and see if we can share it. Facebook.com also partnered with factcheck.org. And usually their like approved posts will get a little check mark to show that they're true or not validated. Phil says a related thing to consider: how to convince people that their sources might not be reliable and they already consume a lot of fake news. Yes, right. So it has to do with what is your news environment, your research environment, ecosystem, and how are you creating that. So here's one tool, and feel free to continue sharing any resources in the chat. But this is one tool that I really like, and I will put the link in the chat also. Cut and paste in the chat. But this is a visual tool that we can use to assess the reliability of sources too. So here we have an axis grid, and let me make this a little bit full screen. On the x-axis, we have the political bias. So is this a source that is far left, far right? Is it more in the middle? And then on the y-axis, we see the reliability of it. Awesome. Jasmine shared that predatory journals article, right? So what is one source that we usually get information from? I like to watch a lot of CNN. So if I type in CNN in this tool, what it'll do is it'll pop up CNN on this axis, and it'll tell me where does it fall in terms of political bias. So CNN is a little bit left, towards the left, but in terms of variation or reliability, has a lot of complex analysis or a mix of fact reporting. Is there another source we want to pop in here and see if we can find it on the grid?
You mentioned the AP.
Yeah, the AP, awesome.
ProPublica.
Associated Press. Right, yeah, so AP is closer to the middle, neutral or balanced, and it's further up and more reliable. Yeah, there was another one you mentioned, Steve?
ProPublica.
ProPublica, huh? ProPublica, yeah, let's see. Yeah, so ProPublica falls closer to the more reliable and closer to the left side. But this is another way, like even the places that your information is being portrayed, being very selective about that, and doing some background research. You can also display all the sources. So if you want to just get a general idea of what everybody's doing. One sec, let me just stop.
Can you tell us just a little bit about their methodology as far as how they're able to figure out?
Yeah, great question.
Factors.
Great question, Steve. So they look at yeah, so down here they talk about it. I don't know their particular algorithm, but I'm assuming that they dig back to the original sources and where these organizations are getting their information from. That's a good question. I'm not sure of their particular methodology for.
And I'm going to shamelessly plug our next session where if you don't want to trust these ones, we're actually going to learn how to actually create our own ones through programming. So we don't need to rely on these other ones. So stay tuned for the next session. Yeah,
so Marta asked a good question. And the point that we're trying to make here is it's super important to be critical of everything, right? Even this tool that we're using, which is why we want to make our own. Awesome. So I'm gonna go back to our slide deck and present. Awesome. So Nico said he knows people that rely on news from Epoch and definitely lead to heavy discussions. Yeah. Yeah. So sign up for the newsletter to make sure you get updated on our upcoming session. All right. So here's where we're going to go into some more breakout time before we close out. But this is going to be your chance to play around with making your own tool. So Steve is going to drop a link in the chat. And that link is going to go to this Google Slides document. And I'll explain a little bit about what we're going to do once we go into the groups. All right, so there's about 10 slides here. And on each slide, it's the same thing. But we're just asking you to create a rubric, essentially. What are some of the things you're looking for when you are looking at a news source on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter? What are some of the criteria that you're looking for, and how would you rate it? So as a teacher, we use rubrics all of the time. So this would be an example of a rubric, right? We have our criteria that we're looking for, and then the different levels of that criteria. So in the breakout rooms, you're going to play around with this idea. We'll come back for a little bit, share out, and then we'll revise our ideas. Also, so on the top of each slide indicates a group number. Your breakout room is going to be this group number. So if you're in breakout room number 2, then you're going to work on slide number 2. If you're in breakout room 3, you're going to work on slide number 3. What questions do we have before we hop into the breakout rooms? And again, the question that you're trying to work through that slide, that PowerPoint slide is, what are some of the factors that you can use to help assess reliability? Awesome. So Steve, you can pop open those breakout rooms and feel free to, at the bottom, there should be a call for help feature if you want us to pop in for clarification.
Okay. Yeah, make sure if you haven't done so already, go ahead and click the link. It will disappear when we go into breakout rooms. Okay. So we'll have about 7 minutes in these breakout rooms.
All right, people are coming back. Awesome. So people are joining us back. We'll give them a few minutes, or like a minute, once they come back in. Awesome. Welcome back to the room. Welcome back. A couple people coming back to us. Awesome. Cool. Welcome back, everyone. So I hope everyone started to have some good discussions about the criteria that you use when you assess a reliable source. Before we present out our rubrics, because I think most of us still have some work to do, I do want to show you one more tool that I use with my high school students. And this tool is called the CRAP test. All right, so the CRAP test is another test that you can use to determine the reliability of a source. The C stands for currency, so the timeliness. When was this information posted? Usually an article from 2020 is going to be more reliable than an article from the 80s. Relevance, is this relevant to the topic at hand? Does this even have anything to do with what we're looking at? Who's the intended audience? What's the appropriate level? The authority or the source of the information. So I saw a couple of these in the rubrics that we started so far. Like, who's the author, the publisher, the sponsor who funded this work? What are the author's credentials? And we mentioned that in my group. Is the author qualified to write on this topic? Accuracy, the reliability or truthfulness. Where does this information come from? Is it supported with data? What kind of data is it? Is it qualitative, quantitative data? Has this information been reviewed or referenced at all? We mentioned the reliability score. And then finally, the purpose. Why does this information exist? So what I want us to do is, you should see at the top of your screen, it says Josh Modeste is sharing his screen. If you click that, you should see an annotate option. And when you annotate, I want you to put some stamps on some of these criteria that you think are important, and ones that you would want to add to your rubric if they're not already there. So again, on the top, you should see the green bar where it says Josh Modeste's screen sharing. There should be a drop-down menu which allows you to annotate. Awesome, I see Jane on here. Cool. Awesome, thanks. Jasmine also wrote the instructions for annotation in the chat. So I'll give us about 2 minutes to. Nice, I see a lot of stars and checks. Awesome. So it looks like most of these. Does anyone want to share which one they annotated and why they think that might be a really important criteria? Feel free to unmute yourself. Give us about 1 more minute. Timer. 30 more seconds. Awesome. So looks like you guys are full of crap because we annotated this up. But yeah, these are some other criteria that we could add to our rubrics. Keep that in mind. So what we're gonna do in a few is we're actually gonna go back into the same rooms, and you're just gonna finish up, revise your rubric, try to make it a tool that we could share, and we're gonna present when we come back. So maybe within your group, try to choose one person that will talk a little bit about what your thought process is. What questions do we have before we pop back into the breakout rooms to revise our rubrics and then come back to share? Awesome. So Steve, you can pop those rooms back open, and make sure you choose one participant to present back when we come back.
So we'll have 10 minutes for this. Opening up the rooms now. Is there a blank screen for you, Jasmine? Below?
Yeah, I think that's Alex, who is hanging out with baby. So.
Gotcha. Cool.
All right, looks like we're joining back. And I know most people didn't get a chance to finish through the rubric, but due to an interest of time.
Well, time is flying pretty quickly on this.
Yeah.
It's already like 5:30.
I know. That means we're doing a good job, or let me just make sure people are coming out of the breakout rooms. All right, we still have a couple people coming back, so give them a few. Awesome. Welcome back, everyone. So let's do a quick share out of what we spoke about in our small groups and developing our rubric, and also developing our thinking about how we approach these different sources. So I'll put them on the spot. Does anyone from group one want to talk about our little tool here that we created? All right, I can share out for my group. So some of the criteria came up was comparing it to existing info. What that might look like is maybe cross-referencing with other sources, or looking for keywords, looking at the credentials of experts. So someone in my group mentioned that credentials are important, but also sometimes the intentions of the credentialed people is also important to look at, because we can have people with credentials that are purposefully trying to deceive people. The genuineness of the source and explicit bias. So looking at the funding source of this information, the intent of why they're sharing this info. Are they trying to inform us of something, persuade us of something, etc. The balance of arguments, if appropriate. So the tone of the article or film or whatever source it is we're looking at. Are they giving us the pros and the cons, or are they just saying what's good about what they're sharing with us, or the bad things about other things? Qualifying info as anecdote, research, or reproducibility, data-driven, anecdotal. How is the data presented? Is it in graphs and tables? Is there statistics like Steve mentioned earlier? Or is it written up in anecdotes? The formatting and spelling errors, we thought that was pretty self-explanatory. Like if there are formatting or spelling issues, then that's probably a no-go. And also the timeliness, which we got from the CRAT test. When was this published or produced? And also, as we're thinking about this, I mentioned this to my group, but these are potential things that we could quantify and develop a program to sift these things out, like set a parameter for timeliness, and throw in an article and maybe spit back out whether this meets our criteria or not. So, all right, so I'll pass it to group 2. Who's the volunteer from group 2 that wants to share out?
All right, I'll start off from group 2. But if anyone else from group 2 wants to also chip into something I missed, go ahead. Our criteria is fairly small. We did have a great discussion though. Objectivity and scale and institutional expert backing are all big parts of it. Where we were considering like what was the intention. One of our group members actually made like a funnel of like the steps each way to get to the knowledge. To what's reliable, but something that kind of caught us and we were discussing was like, I wrote it down here, but I guess you can go back to objectivity in a way, but it's pre-notions, biases that we have going in, and like maybe if you see a news article that you already know or assume that it's false, right? This is Jane's work. I can't see her video. I don't know if she's showing it or not, but it's okay. But the whole thing is that everyone has pre-biases going into information. They might assume like in the hypothetical, okay, if for so long there's been this knowledge / assumption that 5G does not actually cause anyone harm, but all of a sudden tomorrow they figured out it does. People are already having biases going into it, something that's false, that it's not reliable, and it's like, how do you break away from that? How do you create a criteria that makes it reliable, that you can break these assumptions and pre-knowledge and superstition? I mean, we've also had like a story of, I even wrote down the name of even scientists of having like our major beliefs of the majority overwhelming the small minority that like might be correct or have valid input on some things. So it's a strange balance, and we couldn't go further with we didn't go further with the criteria on that, but we were discussing heavily on that, like these more subjective ends of reliability. You know, what do we want to believe in, or what do we already believe in? So yes.
Awesome. That was beautiful. Cool. All right. Next up, we got group 3. Anyone want to share out what went on in group 3?
I can start. So the first thing we discussed was how many other news sites have reported the same thing. So sometimes you see like this very clickbaity article, and then you read something that's like it seems really I don't know, really surprising, or really like, wow, this really happened. But then if you look into it, like if there's just like the one side that's like reporting this, then it might not be true, or it might be exaggerated. Then we also discussed that it's also important that they have to see if they have any like professionals reference. So basically like, who are their sources? Like did they talk to like a professional in that field, or is it just like their neighbor that told them like that happened, or that thing was true? Something that we also thought that we were missing in the first round was timeliness. And this we linked back to like kind of like the context of the research or the news. So like it's not the same thing to read something about the internet like from 20 years ago versus 10 years ago versus now. So they might report on the internet in very different ways because the technology has also evolved. So just keeping that in mind is important. And also, like, does this topic even make sense? Like, is it just too widespread or too narrow? And then we talked about bias of the source itself. So we were discussing how sometimes there is research or like products that were built with just one user in mind. So like airbags was the example, like it was built for men, and then they realized that it didn't work as well on women because they have a different build than men. And then also like the sample sizes of research is not the same thing, saying like, oh, we like 50% of people agree with this claim. If you're like like sample size was like 10 people, is not the same as like, oh, we asked like 1,000 or 10,000 people. So yeah, that was some of our findings and criteria.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing. Cool. So it's really interesting that in all of our groups we had some overlap, but we also had some differences in some of the things that we looked at, or maybe some of the ways that we perceived them. So the last thing that we were going to do, but we'll do a quick version of it, is we were going to share with you two articles, and I'll pull them up. I think Steve is, yeah, good job, room 3. So Steve, if you could just put the links in the chat, and I'll pull them up on my screen. But also, typically the communication of this news is really, really important. So certain journal articles, they're not for everybody to read. Like, you need a certain amount of content knowledge. You need a certain amount of content knowledge and context to be able to understand a scientific journal article. So what a lot of organizations will do is they will write kind of like a layperson article, or an article that's translated for more people to understand. So for example, these are some articles from a lab that I worked in, the New York Stem Cell Foundation. And they have two versions of basically the same information. I'll stop my camera real quick while this loads. But they have a journal article written up in Stem Cells Translational Medicine. They have a DOI, all of the fancy bells and whistles that we'd look for, references, things like that. But then they take it and they put it into this really digestible way to understand what they're talking about. So like when organizations are trying to translate their work or communicate their news in different ways, what are some of the ways that this version, this layperson version, what are some ways that this might meet the criteria for being reliable, or some ways that it might not meet the criteria as much as maybe this scientific article? And feel free to unmute or type it in the chat. What might be some ways that this translated version might not meet all of the criteria that we spoke about?
I feel like lack of specification, like lack of context kind of, and then also what we were talking about, like statistics, if you have a lot of specific like tests you run within it, or like analytics that you can't condense into like a bite-sized bit, those are lost.
Definitely. Yeah, so the statistics and the data analysis. Phil says less citations. Yeah. Anything else why this translated version might not meet all of our criteria?
Maybe the lack of industry-specific words might create some ambiguity, or it might be less concise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like specifically in science, we love to use jargon and make up words for concepts that are super complicated and long, but that might not include some of this jargon. And an expert in the field might read this and say, oh, they didn't include this term that I'm familiar with. So Matt mentions important concepts may not be easily translatable to the layman. Yeah, there's definitely some complex procedures and techniques used in here. Cool. So again, we would have taken some time to dig into those, but those links are in the chat if you'd like. Before we move on, any other questions on our tools that we created or next steps?
One thing I'll mention while you guys are thinking about that, I'll put a link to the chat. And this is my challenge to all of you, is to, and you can feel free to look at it while we're going through the closing out, but using the criteria that you went through, figure out if this article that I'm sharing now, if it's real or fake. So it'll be a PDF, it'll come out. So start thinking about that. And we'll do the full reveal at the end after we close out. And I see Josh is opening up now.
There's another sample. All right, and that brings us to our closing. As we take some time to go through that article, you guys can let us know what you think about it. But once again, thanks again for taking your Saturday afternoon to take some time with us to learn about a really important topic that I think we got into some really good discussions about, and we were able to create a tool. And that was essentially our goal out of this, is having you walk away with something that you can use when you're looking at a news source or looking at Facebook or scrolling through Instagram. What are some of the criteria that you in your mind have created that will help you determine what's real and what's not? And we'll open it up for questions if anyone has.
Lots of good feedback, some talking about the way that it's written, lots of X's, some about the number of authors, lots of different things, and the credentials of the authors. So what is interesting about this article is a couple of things. One, it got accepted into a journal, an academic journal. One that's a web, that's more open source. So this is a academically accepted article. And the second part of it is that it's fake. And what's interesting about that part is not only is it fake, so it kind of looks like it's a real article, right? Has some of the semblances of a journal article, has some data there. It is, as someone mentioned, completely AI generated. It is 100% nonsense. None of it is real. No part of it is. And what they've done is 3 MIT students actually had their own, this doesn't work anymore, but there was once upon a time, you could actually go in and I believe if you go to the encode or the about page, you could actually create your own user-generated article that it would ask you for the authors. You could type in your name and then it'd be able to tell you, and then it would randomly create it. So Josh, Teon, and myself, we could have typed in our names, press generate, and then it would create an article that looks similar to this, but with other random variables and pulling from other articles. So that was something that, as you see here in one of the articles, that these 3 MIT students created their AI generated article and submitted a whole bunch of them to a whole bunch of journals to see where they would get accepted. And they got accepted to some other conferences and stuff like that too. So it shows you no process is perfect. And it's always keep an eye out and be open and be aware for our next session where we'll get to dive in. So a big thanks from on our side, everyone on our side, for taking the time, as Josh mentioned, for being able to attend today. Really appreciate all your guys' time. Big thanks to Jasmine and to GenSpace for being able to host us and being able to let us come to you guys. So really big thanks to them too. So be on the lookout. Jasmine has in the chat how to stay in touch, also the feedback form. Looking forward to hearing your guys' voice, and also looking forward to hopefully seeing all of you guys in our next session too. Take care, everyone. And be on the lookout for fake news.